Hello, dear friends, and welcome to a softly spoken read-through of British kings and queens, from the Anglo-Saxons to the House of Windsor. At the time of recording this video, the coronation of King Charles III is a couple of days away, so it seems a prudent opportunity to read through the history of our monarchy. The majority of my channel is whispered content, so if you do prefer whispered read-throughs or whispered content, you will find plenty more on the English Gentleman ASMR channel. This is a small book, but a very dense one. As you can see, we have images, but we also have a lot of text to work through. However, I will do my best to summarize as we make our way through this compendium. So we have an introduction to the monarchy, but I think we can skip that and start learning about the monarchs directly. But out of interest, the history of monarchy in England starts as the Roman hegemony over northwest Europe broke down. So, let's jump in to our very first monarch. We start with Egbert from the House of Wessex, 769 to 839. He was the son of Aelmund of Kent and an unknown woman. He was the descendant of Cedric, the founder of the Kingdom of Wessex. So, for the first 20 or so years, little is known of Egbert's rule as King of Wessex, but he seems to have managed to have kept the kingdom independent from the aggressive King Offa of Mercia. In 815, he is recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle as ravaging the territories of the Dumnonia tribes in the west, which is now Cornwall. The Mercian domination of southern England was ended by defeat at the Battle of Ellendon, which is somewhere in Wiltshire, and it seems that Beornwulf of Mercia attacked the Wessex army. In retaliation, when Beornwulf invaded Essex in response, which is where I live, he was killed, as was his successor, which allowed Egbert to invade Mercia in 829 and drive King Wiglaf into exile. He then claims to be King of Mercia and is described as Bretwalda, or Wide Ruler, in other words, all of Britain. Later on, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says that the Northumbrians submitted to Egbert, but other sources say he pillaged the lands there before they submitted. The exiled king of Mercia, Wiglaf, returned in 830 but didn't manage to retain East Anglia, and Egbert lost his control over southern England. Historians conjecture that this was due to his loss of the foreign Frankish support, which had won him initial power, but he continued to control most of southeast England, incorporated into the kingdoms of Essex and Ghent into Wessex, and retained control of Cornwall. His legacy was the domination of Wessex over southern England, the consolidation into Wessex of the southwest, and the permanent incorporation of Kent and Sussex into the kingdom. Egbert died in 839 and was buried in Winchester. No records remain of a marriage, but he did have legitimate children. So this, of course, is coming from the time where England or Britain was made up of independent states, a little bit like the United States of America. Then we are followed by Aethelwulf, the House of Wessex, ruling from 839 to 856. So while Egbert was still king of Wessex, his son Aethelwulf took his father's army to Kent and conquered in his name. He was known as the sub-king of Kent and controlled lands which included Kent, Essex, Sussex and Surrey. When his father died, Aethelwulf was crowned at Kingston upon Thames, and became king of a Wessex that now incorporated the previously independent lands of Cornwall, Kent, and other parts of southeast England. So the rest of the reign relies on the none too reliable Anglo-Saxon chronicle, and Viking raids increased in both number and size and presented the greatest danger to the kingdom and to Britain as a whole. In 850, the Viking army wintered in England for the first time on Thanet. From there they stormed Canterbury and London. In 851, Aethelwulf, with his son Aethelbald beside him, defeated the Vikings in battle at Ackley in Surrey. Personally, he's said to have been very religious, coupled with remarkably little political sense, although his greatest failure could be said to have fathered far too many sons, 5 plus 1 daughter, with his wife Osburga, of whom very little is recorded. One of his first decisions on inheriting the throne was to split the kingdom. He kept the original Wessex lands, which are Wiltshire, Hampshire, Dorset and Devon, and settled the newly acquired lands in the East Kent, Sussex, Surrey and Essex to his eldest son Aethelstan, who ruled there as sub-king. His piety instilled in him a great desire to make a pilgrimage to Rome, and he sent his youngest son in 853, Alfred, who was then 4 years old, and joined him there in 855, the year he was widowed. In Rome he met Pope Benedict III and bestowed lavish riches on the clergy. On the return, he married Judith, the 12-year-old daughter of Charles the Bald, king of the Western Franks and great-granddaughter of Charlemagne. But during the absence, Aethelstan died, and his next son, Aethelbald, was conspiring with the Bishop of Sherborne and the Ealdorman of Somerset to prevent his father from resuming the throne on his return. But when he came back, instead of plunging the country into civil war, Aethelwulf did not contest Aethelbald's taking hold of Wessex, and instead kept hold of Kent and the southeast himself. Aethelbald ruled there until his father's death at age 62 on January 13th, 858. Here we have Aethelbald. That's Aethelwulf. And then Aethelbald, ruling in 856 to 860. He was the second son of King Aethelwulf of Wessex, and his first wife, Osburga. Little is known about his early life. In 850 he was given the rank of ealdorman, and when he was in his early 20s was left in charge of the western lands of Wessex. His brother Aethelbert was given charge of Kent, and his father went on his pilgrimage to Rome in 855. From Aethelbald's point of view, the danger was twofold. Aethelwulf could father new rival sons who didn't, to threaten the succession of the throne. He may have intended to leave his throne to his youngest and favourite son, Alfred, who later went on to become Alfred the Great. Either way, Aethelbald would be the loser. So with a very real threat of civil war, Aethelwulf conceded the majority of Wessex. And when Aethelwulf died, Aethelbald inherited his entire kingdom with his younger brother becoming sub-king of Kent. Aethelbald was crowned at Kingston-upon-Thames and soon scandalised by many of his people and the church by marrying his stepmother, the 16-year-old Judith. Her father, Charles the Bald, was furious and forced his unlucky daughter into a nunnery at Senlis. The marriage was annulled in 860 on the grounds of consanguinity. In January 862 she eloped with Baldwin, Count of Flanders, and became Countess of Flanders. Aethelbald was only to reign for 4 years before dying childless in December 860, at the age of about 35, in Sherborne in Dorset. Very dramatic. You can see how a lot of fantasy and Game of Thrones-esque literature is born out of historical fact. We then have Aethelbert, reigning from 860 to 866. He was the third son of King Aethelwulf of Wessex and Osburga. Very little is known about him or his reign, and when his brother Aethelbald was left in charge of the kingdom while their father went on pilgrimage to Rome, Aethelbert was given the lands of Kent to look after, which he probably retained as sub-king under his brother when he became king of Wessex. When Aethelbald died in 860, Ethelbert became king in his turn, and was also crowned at Kingston upon Thames on the coronation stone. Wessex was still suffering from regular Viking incursions, particularly in Northumbria and around the coast of Kent. Ethelbert married and had 2 sons by a woman whose name has been lost in history. Aldhelm was killed during a Viking raid during his uncle Alfred's reign, and Ethelwood, who claimed the throne in 899 on Alfred's death, he was rejected and had to flee to refuge in the Danelaw, where he was killed in 900. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Ethelbert had been a good peacekeeping king, died in 866, and was buried at Sherborne Abbey beside his brother Ethelbald, who was succeeded by his younger brother Ethelred, who we know as Alfred the Great. Born when the Vikings were threatening to overwhelm England, Alfred was the 5th son of the Aethelwulf, king of the West Saxons. Alfred's first notable victory against the Vikings was at the Battle of Ashdown, 871, in Berkshire, when he led his brother's army and routed the Vikings. But they resumed their victorious ways, and by 878 had established their base at Chippenham in Wiltshire, where they set out to destroy the kingdom of Wessex. Alfred lost the following battles, and while he refused to surrender, he did accept the necessity to pay regular tribute to keep the Danes at bay. With many of his people retreating to the Isle of Wight, Alfred and a few of his thanes disappeared into the Somerset tidal marshes to hide from the Vikings and have a base for their hit-and-run tactics. While there, he is supposed to have been charged with watching a batch of cakes cooking, but preoccupied with battle plans, he neglected his task and the cakes burned. Perhaps it was then that he decided to build his own fortified base in the marshes at Athelney, from where he summoned a new, highly mobile army. Here there is the statue of Alfred the Great, erected in 1899 in Winchester. In the resulting Treaty of Wedmore that came after the Battle of Edington, Alfred made peace with the Danes and accepted the inevitability of them remaining in England. King Guthrum converted to Christianity, and Alfred stood as his sponsor. By 886, Alfred had wrestled London from the Danish occupation, and in a succeeding treaty, England was partitioned using the Roman Watling Street as the east-west boundary. The Danes took eastern and northern England. The area became known as Danelaw, and by law England and Danes became equal, and Alfred took western and southern England, including Kent and West Mercia. I used to live on Watling Street in Northamptonshire, a huge road that cuts in a straight line almost right through the heart of England. To seal this bond, Alfred married Aethswith, a Mercian noblewoman, and gave his daughter Aethelfled in marriage to the ealdorman of Mercia. Another daughter was married to the Count of Flanders, a valuable ally and leader of a strong naval power. From his new palace in Winchester, Alfred considered how to cope with the constant threat of the Danes, and drew up his army consisting of the thanes, noblemen, and the fyrd, the militia, into a flexible roster of militia who could rapidly respond. Yet not be away from their homes and farms for too long at a stretch. He also reorganised the defences of Wessex by starting a building programme of well-defended boroughs, fortified settlements, right across southern England. Peasant settlers were given land on the condition they manned the defences when required, and none more than 20 miles from the safety of a burgh. The detail of these grounds and fortifications were recorded in the Burgle Hidage. He also ordered the building of the first English navy, which consisted of big, fast new ships that would defend the southern coastline of England against the raiding Danes. He encouraged the learning of Latin, and was the patron of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the contemporary history of the English people. He established justice across his lands through the use of a legal code assembled from the best laws of earlier rulers, then adding them to his own legal strictures to produce a definitive Anglo-Saxon law. He reformed the coinage and allowed their minting in his new boroughs, On these he was known as the King of the English, not just Wessex. He died aged 50 on October 26, 899, and was buried in Winchester. The first true King of the English, Alfred the Great, was the first ruler to unite the majority of his people under one rule and set up the legal and military establishments to protect them against a dangerous and strong enemy. A lot of the things that we have in place today we can owe to Alfred the Great. Achieved a huge amount in his time on earth. He was then succeeded by his oldest surviving son, Edward the Elder, who reigned 899 to 924. In time he proved to be a very shrewd and able strategist and a very capable administrator who laid many of the foundations for a united and cohesive kingdom from his capital in Winchester. By the end of his reign, the separate kingdoms of Wessex and Mercia had united to form the basis of the future kingdom of England. According to Asser, the Bishop of Sherborne and biographer of King Alfred, Edward was educated at court alongside his younger sister Elfrid. Although known as the king's son, Filius Regis, the heir, Edward was not his father's obvious successor. By Anglo-Saxon precedent, the two sons of King Ethelred, his father's older brother, had a stronger claim to the throne. Aethelwald and Aethelham were about 10 years older and more experienced, plus their mother had been crowned queen, which Edward's mother had not. He first emerges from childhood in the historic record in 893, when, leading his father's army, he was victorious against a large raiding Danish army at Farnham in Surrey. This helped him when his cousin Aethelwald made a bid for the crown in 899 by seizing Wimborne in Dorset and then Christchurch. In reply, Edward marched his army to nearby Banbury, but Aethelwald would not give battle and instead fled one night to Northumbria, where the Danes proclaimed him king in Jorvik. On June 8, 900, Edward was crowned on the coronation stone in Kingston upon Thames. The next year in the fall, Aethelwald and his Viking fleet arrived in Essex, looking for getting the support of the East Anglian Danes in his bid to take the crown of Wessex. The battle was largely indecisive, except that both Aethelwald and the Danish king Eric of Northumberland lost their lives, so not only had Edward eliminated his rival for the throne, but also removed one of the most dangerous Viking leaders. In 909 and 920 he set about extending and uniting his kingdom against the Danes with the assistance of a strong, militarily capable and loyal ally. His older sister Aethelflaed, the wife of Aethelred, Ealdorman of Mercia, after whose death in 911 became known as the Lady of the Mercians. Edward first made peace with the East Anglians and then in 909 sent an army north to attack Northumbria. In return, Danes attacked Mercia, and on August the 5th, 910, the two sides met at the Battle of Tettenhall in Staffordshire. They had a decisive victory over the Northumbrian Vikings, although Aethelred died there. This battle has gone down in history as the defeat of the last great Viking army to ravage England. The Danes never again posed a real threat to the kingdom, and never raided south of the Humber. So following this victory, the country was more united than ever. To make sure the Danes stayed in the north, Edward and his sister built a series of 28 fortresses as civilian and military strong points in strategically crucial positions along the width of the northern lands. As his reign progressed, he consolidated his hold over Mercia, East Anglia and Essex, taking over and conquering the formerly Danish-held lands, the southern Danes' law, and taking control of the important cities of London and Oxford. He died leaving in 1918, Aethelflaed died, leaving her daughter Aethwen as her successor, but Edward moved quickly to take all her Mercian holdings into his own hands, which may not have been so peaceable and easy as contemporary records suggest. By that same year, all the Danes living south of the River Humber submitted to Edward, and according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, by the time he died, even the Danish King of York, the Anglian Lord of Bamber, and the King of the Britons of Strathclyde, and the King of Scots had acknowledged Edward as father and lord. Edward died on July the 17th, 924, at the age of about 50, while leading his army against the Welsh Mercian rebellion at Tharndon-upon-Dee in Cheshire. He fathered around 14 legitimate children, and was briefly succeeded by his own son Alfred Alfred reigned July 18th to August the 2nd, 924, a very short reign. He was the King of Wessex for 15 days, and not a lot else is known about him. It's even possible that he was a hermit living in Bridgnorth, Staffordshire at the time of his father's death. He was proclaimed by the men of Wessex as their king on the death of his father, and at the same time his older half-brother, Aethelstan, was proclaimed King of Mercia by the Mercians in Gloucester. Alfred died suddenly, cause unknown, in Oxford on August the 2nd, 924, before his coronation. This could have been perpetrated by Aethelstan or some of his supporters. Never made it. We then have Aethelstan the Glorious, reigning 925 to 939. Alfred the Great's grandson and son of King Edward the Elder, Aethelstan became the first king of all England through his military leadership. In the north, this was achieved through ejecting the Danes from the city of York in 927, and in the south by taking control of Cornwall. Neighbouring rulers, such as the North British kings, in other words the Welsh kings, and King Constantine II of Scotland, were forced to submit to him as father and lord. Constantine, at the Treaty of Emmet Bridge in 927, and the Welsh following submission at Hereford, when they had to agree to paying enormous annual tribute, which included 25,000 oxen annually. In 937, many of these opponents united under the leadership of the King of Scotland, and with help from Olaf of Dublin, attempted an invasion of England that Aethelstan repelled with an army drawn from across the land, with a decisive victory at the Battle of Brunanbar in 937. Here we have a scene in the capital of an illuminated version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. And there is the elevation of Edward the Elder at his coronation. The shire system was established across England at this point, and the growth of town life encouraged. He also established important dynastic ties with Western rulers by marrying off his half-sisters to important noble allies in Scandinavia, Saxony, and Brittany. He was a deeply religious man and a great collector and giver of religious works of art and relics. He worked hard to gain the support of the Church for his rule, and died on October the 27th, 939, and died in his favourite Malmesbury Abbey, where his tomb can still be seen. He died childless and was succeeded by his 18-year-old half-brother, Edmund, who we can see here, and was known as Edmund the Magnificent. Here he is in a stained glass window. He was the son of Edward the Elder, and his third wife, Edgith, succeeded his half-brother Aethelstan to the throne at 939 at the age of 18. He hadn't been on the throne long before he was challenged by first King Olaf Guthruthson of Dublin, who returned to northern England. He'd been defeated at the Battle of Brunanbar in 937 by Aethelstan, and the young Edmund, but 2 years later in 939, occupied York, probably by invitation of the Northumbrians, before moving south to raid the Midlands of England. Edmund marched his army north, where he besieged Olaf and Archbishop Wulfstan of York in Leicester. After a lot of negotiation, a peace treaty was agreed in 940, and allowed Edmund to cede the lands of northeast Mercia between Watling Street and the River Humber to Olaf, King of York. A few years later, in 941, Olaf was killed while out raiding in Northumbria and was replaced by his cousin, Olaf Sigthrundsson. Edmund seized the opportunity, moved north again, reconquered the lost territories of the 5 boroughs of the East Midlands. Olaf then realised on the losing side he had to make peace and was baptised a Christian, with Edmund standing as his godfather. In 944, Ragnar Gulfrithson challenged Olaf for the throne of York, but Edmund was now strong enough to take York himself, expel the rivals, and take control of Northumbria. Olaf was ousted from the throne and fled to Dublin. He became King of Dublin, but remained Edmund's ally. In 945, Edmund consolidated his latest conquest by ravaging the British kingdom of Strathclyde and killing King Donald MacDonald. But rather than occupying the country, He signed a mutual treaty of military support by land and sea with the new overlord, Malcolm I, and conceded his rights over the lands there. This was the first treaty between England and Scotland that established the borders of Anglo-Saxon England and ensured that the borders of the two countries would thenceforth be peaceful. It was during this period that the monasteries began a revival across England, helped by the mutual support between the Crown and Archbishop Odo. Edmund took the opportunity provided by peace to reorganise the coinage and issue 2 new law codes. He married twice. His first wife, Elgiva, later Saint Elgiva, gave him his sons Edwy and Edgar, and when she died in 944 he married Aethelflaed, but they had no children. His death came unexpectedly. On May 26, 946, at the age of about 25, he was present at a party in his royal villa at Bucklechurch, Gloucestershire, when he spotted Leofa, an outlawed thief, in the crowd. The latter was ordered to leave, and when he refused, a fight broke out between Leofa and a steward. It seemed when Edmund tried to intervene, he was fatally stabbed in the stomach by Leofa and died almost instantly. Leofa was then himself killed. Wow, what an end. Edred ruled from 946 to 955, who was the son of King Edward the Elder, and his third wife, Edgiva, daughter of Seagarm, Alderman of Kent. And following the murder of his older brother Edmund I in 946, Edred, who was about the age of 21, was chosen to be king by the Witan, instead of Edmund's 2 sons, Edwy and Edgar, who were too young. This was an era of political infidelity, and allegiances changed quickly, according to prevailing circumstances. In the late 950, the Northerners revolted and appealed to Olaf to be their leader, but within 2 years swapped allegiance again back to Eric Bloodaxe. He too was abandoned in 954 by his fickle supporters, who returned to pledge their allegiance to Edred. Eric Bloodaxe left York and England for good, and although a proven and successful soldier who battled the Vikings many times, Edred suffered from poor health. He was reportedly small and never very strong, although a brave soldier. At times he could hardly eat, thanks to a persistent and unidentified stomach problem. After ruling for nearly 9.5 years, he died of his mystery stomach ailment on November the 23rd, 955, at his palace in Frome in Somerset. He was somewhere in his 30s. Against his wishes, he was buried alongside his ancestors in Winchester Cathedral. Here's the Victorian image of Edred, King of Wessex, as taken from A History of England. And here on this side we have another Victorian image. Edwy's reign was troubled with conflict with his brother Edgar. Edwy Allfair, 955 to 959. So aged somewhere between 13 and 16 years old, Edwy, also known as Edwig, succeeded his uncle to the throne of England in 955. At his coronation feast he fell foul of Archbishop Odo and Dunstan, later St. Dunstan, Abbot of Glastonbury, to such an extent that Dunstan went into exile and wouldn't return until Edwy's death. There are few sources for a detailed examination of Edwy's reign, and the main one, A Life of St. Dunstan, was of course written by someone who was not fond of him, so it's jaundiced our view of him. In 957, the Thanes of Mercia in Northumbria, feeling, it is said, sidelined by the lavishness disposed on Wessex and supported by Edwy's enemy, Archbishop Odo, switched their allegiance to Edwy's brother Edgar. Civil war threatened. The two sides met in battle at Gloucester with Edwy, the loser. Rather than risk all-out civil war, the nobility agreed to a partition of the country, with the River Thames as the boundary. Edwy retained the south, Wessex and Kent, and Edgar took everything to the north. After this was settled, Edwy was able to rule more wisely, the chronicler tells us, supporting the church and granting many gifts and charters. He died young, at about 18 or 19, and was buried in Winchester Cathedral beside his ancestors. His throne was then taken by his brother Edgar, who reunited the kingdom. And here we have Edgar the Peaceful, or Peaceable, ruled 959 to 975. He was orphaned by the time he was 3. His mother died within a year of bearing him, and his father was murdered 2 years later. After much discussion, Edmund was fostered in the household of the most powerful noble in the country, Aethelstan Half-King, Alderman of East Anglia, and his wife, Aelfwyn. Aethelstan was an enthusiastic supporter of monastic reform and ensured that his young charge was tutored by the Benedictine monk St. Aethelwald, Abbot of Abingdon. This strongly religious upbringing was to greatly influence his decisions and lifestyle. In 955, his 14-year-old brother Edwy became king on the death of their uncle, King Edred. 2 years later, the northern Thanes of Mercia lost faith in their monarch and switched their allegiances to Edgar, making him the king of the north in preference to Edwy, who was also in conflict with the other great power to the land, the church. In 958, with the support of the nobility, England was divided, as we learned previously. Edwy died in 959, leaving Edgar King of England at the age of 16, and was initially crowned at Kingston upon Thames, and then again in a bigger, more formal ceremony at Bath in 973, where he was declared King of the English. One of his first moves was to appoint Dunstan Archbishop Canterbury, and in the process push forward the monastic reform movement. Both Edgar and Dunstan were determined to reform the great monastic houses and clean up their lax way of life by imposing the austere monastic discipline of Saint Benedictine. This is where we saw Benedictine monasteries appear and take huge areas of land. After his second coronation, Edgar assembled a great army and marched forward to Chester, where the kings of the north included King Kenneth of the Scots, Malcolm of Strathclyde and Cumbria, and King Maccas of Man and the Western Isles, Iago of Gwynedd, and possibly also King Edwallan of Monarchs and King Sigurd. They all came and pledged their loyalty and submission. Edgar's reign is characterized by being comparatively peaceful, as he benefited from the political unity of the kingdom, instead of the numerous rival kingships of earlier Britain. One of the most significant actions of his reign was to reform the coinage. In 973, all coins in circulation were called back to the 40 or so mint towns where they were reminted with a new design. This regulated the coinage and reinforced his image among his countrymen. He died on July the 8th, 975, aged 32, and was buried in St. Dunstan's Abbey in Glastonbury, where he was soon prayed to as a saint. He was a popular, peaceful time monarch, and the first king to rule all three of the major kingdoms of Northumbria, Mercia, and Wessex. He's credited with reorganising the English fleet, which sources say circumnavigated Britain every year in a show of might and power. The only major blot on his character is his liaison with Wulfrith, a nun who bore him a daughter, Eagrith. Edgar left 3 sons from his 2 wives. From Aethelflaed, a boy later known as Edward the Martyr, and from Aethelwith, 2 sons, Aetheling Edmund, who died young, and Aethelred the Unready. For almost 100 years until the Norman conquest, every succession to the throne of England was strenuously contested. So we then see Edward the Martyr take the throne in 975 through to 978, who was the oldest son of King Edgar, and his first wife, Aethelflaed, although possibly of his mistress, Wulfrith. He was in his early teens when his father died, and the succession to the throne was disputed by supporters of his half-brother Aethelred, who was 7. But Edward was supported by the Witan, Oswald of Worcester, the Archbishop of York, Dunstan, Archbishop of Canterbury, who crowned him. At the time of Edward's accession to the throne, famine was stalking the kingdom, and anti-monastic feelings were running high. In Mercia in particular, many monasteries were destroyed and monks thrown off the land. Edward was devout and enjoyed handing large endowments of land and money to churches and monasteries, much to the outrage of the local aldermen and thanes. So this caused animosity among the populace in general, who resented the affluent clergy at a time when they were struggling and starving. And outside the church, Edward's unpopularity grew in the 3 short years of his reign, with his own violent outbursts of rage, often offending important people. 3 years into his reign, on March the 18th, 978, Edward was out hunting with horses and dogs in Dorset around Wareham, and near his half-brother's lands at Corfe Castle. Apparently on impulse, he decided to visit his brother, left his retinue behind, and arrived at the castle alone. Contemporary monastic writers recorded that Aethelred's retainers surrounded Edward and stabbed him while still on his horse. It was rumoured a century later that his stepmother handed a glass of mead while one of her retinue stabbed him. Nobody was punished for the atrocity. Aged somewhere between 10 and 13 years, Aethelred was crowned within a month. His legacy was promoted by the church, who'd lost a more than generous sponsor, and he was soon spoken of as a saint, and a cult site was established at Shaftesbury Abbey, where his bones were brought from his original hasty burial site at Wareham. And this is where he died at the hands of an assassin near Corfe Castle. And after miracles took place at his tomb in Shaftesbury Abbey, he was sanctified. After the Reformation, his remains were hidden, and now reside in relics in a church in Brookwood Cemetery in Woking. And we'll end this part with Aethelred the Unready, which seems like a bit of an unfair moniker for somebody to live the rest of time out as. He was the son of Edgar the Peaceable and his second wife, Alfreda, and became the king at the age of 13 on the death of his half-brother, Edward the Martyr, who we just heard was murdered. Indeed, he was unable to gather effective political support, being so young, across the nobility or commoners and the church, who in particular opposed his rule, and worked to turn Edward into a martyr. In 980, initially small-scale Viking raids resumed, and the Danes were allies of the Normans, and so supported each other diplomatically, causing increased tension between England and Normandy. For the sake of harmony, Pope John XV drew up a peace treaty between the two, which was ratified in Rouen in 991. But that same year, a massive Viking raid into England culminated in the Battle of Maldon, and a crushing defeat for the brave Thanes of Essex. To stop such an atrocity happening again, Aethelred agreed to pay the Danish demand for tribute, some £10,000, which would guarantee the peace. But it didn't stop the raids. In 994, a huge Danish fleet arrived in London, where an uneasy treaty was agreed. £22,000 of gold and silver were handed to the Danes to ensure the peace. This tribute became known as Danegeld, but did not stop the raiding, with the Viking fleet using the Isle of Wight as a base. A truce was brought again in 1002 at the cost of £24,000, but only brought temporary respite. Armies continued to arrive and ravage England from the north to south and east to west, with the Danegeld paid at the culmination of each attack and each larger than the last. By 1012, £48,000 weight of silver was handed over to the Danes in London. Aethelred was not a fighting king, and relied on Danegeld and diplomacy for the safety of his kingdom. He maintained a diplomatic alliance with the powerful and ambitious Duke of Normandy, and later married his daughter Emma, establishing the somewhat tenuous claim to the English throne for William, Duke of Normandy, almost 70 years later. Emma herself and her retinue of Normans were generally unpopular, and increased Aethelred's already low personal popularity. Hatred and fear of the Danes and the demands of the Danegeld tax reached such a pitch that on November the 18th, 1002, Aethelred ordered the massacre of all the Danes in England. One of the slain was Gunhilda, sister of Svein Forkbeard, the King of Denmark, and he swore to avenge her. Accordingly, in 1013, Sweyn and his army invaded England, causing a terrified Aethelred and his wife to flee to Normandy to take refuge with her family. But Sweyn unexpectedly died 5 weeks later of an apoplexy while investing Bury St. Edmunds, and the hastily gathered Witan, instead of supporting the claim of Canute, invited Aethelred to return to his throne. Initially joyously received, Aethelred soon alienated his followers again, and they were not sorry when he died in London 1016, with Canute at the gates of the city. Aethelred's legacy was to leave a complicated succession to the throne by fathering many children. First with Aegelflu, the daughter of Thored, Ealdorman of Northumbria. He had 6 sons, including Edmund Ironside, and 4 daughters. His second wife, married in 1002, was Duke Richard II of Normandy's sister, Emma of Normandy, and together they had 2 sons, Edward the Confessor and Alfred, and a daughter. So I think that brings us to a natural end point, working our way through the initial House of Wessex. I've learned a lot about the ancient kings of England and all of the interesting disputes and ends to their reign. I look forward to having you join me next time for more British kings and queens. But until then, goodbye.